Three.
Hi, I'm Dustin Pickering, and this is the New York Parrots Literary Corner. Today we have fabulous guest, Christine Sloan Stoddard, and I'll let her tell her a little bit about herself to get us going, and I hope you enjoy the program. Subscribe to our channel. Go ahead, Christine.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Quite welcome.
I'm based in Brooklyn myself, and I am a writer, a visual artist, and a filmmaker. I have a few different books published, a couple different films that have screened at festivals and are available online. And I've been an artist in residence at venues in New York City and elsewhere.
That's quite a resume there. What leads you, what motivates you to be sort of the multidisciplinary artist you are? Is there a drive? I mean, or is there interest? What interests you in these different disciplines?
Sure. So honestly, they're all connected through storytelling. And I had exposure to all of these forms at a young age. I also come from a family where many people pursue more than one form of creative expression. My father is a documentary filmmaker, but he came out of still photography. My grandfather was a writer of various forms for nonfiction, but also children's stories. And my great-grandmother was a playwright, a visual artist, a model, an actress. And just about everybody in my family has dabbled in at least a couple different forms, and some of them have pursued them more seriously. But again, just with this dual approach.
Oh, interesting. So you have a background there. You have some family that likes to, that's an inspiration to you. That's quite great. That's excellent. It's hard to find good inspiration sometimes. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your various films that you've done that you've already got out and available, and where you can find them.
Sure. So the main one that is the easiest to find online is called Bottled, and it's available on Amazon Prime Video. So if you have a Prime subscription, you can just watch it on Amazon through your Amazon account. It works very similar to Netflix, for instance. In the United States, many people are not as familiar with the streaming options on Amazon, but it's funny because around the world, it's the most popular streaming site.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So tip off to the people in the US there, learn to do that.
Yeah, you log into your Amazon account and there are different movie options. So you can buy it or you can rent it. Either way, you watch it online, or you can download it so that you have it on your computer. But it is a film about a young woman who's coping with the loss of her grandfather. And after reading an article in the newspaper about how talking aloud to your loved ones can help with the grieving process, she tries it. She tries talking aloud to her grandfather, and she just ends up feeling silly. She tries it a few different times, and she texts this close friend about it. They have a conversation, and the friend really encourages her to just keep trying it, even if it feels silly or feels forced, and maybe she'll feel better. So it is a short film, so I won't give away the ending.
Right.
But she does work through this process.
Oh, that's very interesting. You have one other film as well, right? Available.
Yes, so there are two others that are on Amazon Prime. But those are on UK, not the US. So in the US, you can't stream them. However, there are a few other ways to find them. I'll mention Butterflies because that is the easiest to find. It was sponsored by the Visible Poetry Project, so it's available on their website for US viewers. And it's a poetry film that is about the treatment of Black girls in schools, in public schools, and also in the media. So the center of the poem is, this poetry film is really a poem that was written by Terry Alam, who is a poet based in Atlanta. And I worked with an actress, Disney Sebastian, who's also a friend of mine. We met at the Broadway Comedy Club in New York City when we were in the same play. Uh, she personifies the Black girl, just Black girls in general. She's sort of this symbol for Black high school girls in the film. And she does sort of dance through and mime through some of the images that are mentioned in Terry's poem. Disney also narrates the film, so she brings both her voice and her body and her movement to the film.
Oh, interesting. That sounds fascinating. I think it'd be interesting a way of experiencing, your subject, the treatment of Black women and Black girls in schools. So also, you had one other one as well. You said you had 3, right?
Yeah, so Drunken History was written by Benjamin Nardolilli. I directed it. I produced the images for it, edited it. And it is about gentrification in New York City. And I guess it's sort of a march for bohemians, and it really goes through the history of bohemian life in New York City and the way artists and thinkers, intellectuals have moved from different neighborhood to neighborhood, getting pushed out, and how we've come to this point where so many, even before the pandemic, because the poem was actually written before the pandemic. We just did not release the film until the New York City shutdown. But he talks about people getting pushed out into the Hudson Valley and New Jersey and Long Island.
Wow.
But it really goes through the history back to the early to mid 1800s. It's this almost a chant, a manifesto. There are different elements that come into it, and the footage comes from sort of these less glamorous parts of New York City, the places that tourists don't visit, but the places that most of us working class, middle class artists live, because this is where we can afford to live. So there are lots of snippets from different places around the city. That one you can find on Vimeo right now, Vimeo, but it will be coming down soon. It will not be available there for too much longer for US viewers, but for the UK, it's going to stay on Amazon, so you can stream
So
it.
better grab it quick.
Yeah.
Absolutely, got to get on there fast, on the train fast. So you mentioned working class, middle class. What would you consider yourself a working class artist, or of those subjects?
Yeah, so I'm middle class. I was raised middle class, but I do come from a family that has experienced poverty, situational poverty on one side and generational poverty on the other side. So because both of my parents experienced a lot of want early on in their lives, and because my mother, who is Salvadoran and lived there during the Civil War, horrendous Civil War, I was just raised with very conservative ideas about resources, about frugality, about making things last, and just being as resourceful as possible to try and identify opportunities and to make sure that I can always support myself no matter what. But for all sorts of reasons, my parents were able to get out of the situations they were in. And they gave me a stable middle class life. So I'm very grateful for that.
No, absolutely. It's very hard to be poor. I'm it's just it's tedious, it's expensive, as they say. So back to the bohemians and so forth, do you ever coordinate events up there in New York, or do you have
Oh, yeah.
connections out there that you do scene stirring? I guess you could call it.
All the time. And even with the
Uh,
pandemic, I've had a fair number of virtual events, whether as a
right.
host or a participant. But prior to the pandemic, I showed films and read poetry and exhibited artwork
Hmm.
everywhere from the Queens Museum to the Brooklyn Public Library, the New York Transit Museum, 5 Miles Gallery, on and on. Really, that's how I would spend most of my weekends, and often evenings during the week too. I had different events. Some of them were screenings, some of them were poetry readings, some of them were plays, art exhibitions. Others were more hybrid events
Hmm.
where, sure, there might be a film screening, but there's a poetry reading before or after. Or,
Right.
yeah, there's a play, but there's also original artwork in the theater lobby, and you can go meet the artist. Yeah,
Exciting.
I think one of the most beautiful aspects of living in New York City, and one of the reasons why I hope to remain here as long as possible, is that there is a rich culture of public life. And
Hmm.
not just for rich people, there are so many free events. There are so many artists who would throw loft parties, warehouse parties that would
Wow.
involve art. You know, a party could easily have a film screening or paintings on the wall that were up from one night only, or people
Wow.
would share poems or share
It's a
stories.
very interconnected city, you know. A lot of the people
Yeah,
know each other, and there's, there are various people that interact with each other. Like in Houston, it's very much the same, except it's mostly bars and coffee shops. But there are definitely some loft parties out here. So there's some similarities, I think. You know, there's all kinds of stuff. So you also do paintings you do mural work as well, right? So how do you find clients for that, or do they find you? Is there any interesting stories about people you've met through those interactions?
sure. So it really is a combination of things. I run a small company. That's how I make a living. It's called Quail Bell Press and
Right.
Productions. And it's a creative studio. It's a one-woman band, although I do hire other folks from time to time, depending on projects. With murals
Hmm.
specifically, I actually did not start painting until a couple of years ago. I had painted a lot as a child, but then I just gave it up, like many people.
Mhm.
I did continue drawing, and I did make sculptures, and I made other forms of visual art, but painting specifically, I didn't start doing again until, yeah, 2 years ago, 3 years
Oh,
ago.
wow.
Uh, and it was because I was in grad school. I was in a visual art program, but I was mainly doing sculpture and photography work that involved poetry, like still interdisciplinary work,
Mhm.
but not painting. And I had a curator. It was a curator and a professor who told me in separate instances, but almost the same time. It was maybe like a week apart. They were looking at some of my sketches, and both of them said, "Have you ever tried painting?" And I was like, no, not really. I mean, besides like finger paint when I was a kid, I don't know. And I was just really self-conscious about it because I thought, oh, well, I don't have any formal education painting. Why would I
Mhm.
try that? And they said, well, you learned how to draw as a child and you clearly care about color. You have a visual sense. You don't, you really don't need a license to paint. Just
Right.
just watch a few YouTube videos and experiment. Go at it. Just
Start
try.
from scratch.
So I did. I started with
Oh, that's
watercolors.
beautiful. I've seen that one. That's it. I love it. Beautiful.
Yeah, so I started with watercolors because compared to other painting
Impressive.
types of
Hmm.
paint, they're cheap and they're very
Yes.
easy to carry
Oh, wow.
around. You can just carry a little tin and
Right.
then water, get the water from a public restroom. It doesn't matter. You can paint in the park, you can paint in your apartment, you can do watercolors just about anywhere.
Yeah.
Just don't have electronics right next to your wall.
Right. One time I went to the Gulf and I used the water and from the sea to paint, and it created an interesting effect with the salt in the water and things like that. It was really fun. It was really it's a blast. I mean, it's wonderful. So in these murals that you did the mural paintings, I've seen some of those, and there's some sort of symbolic elements to those too. It looks like I think Ramon one had like a panther, and did people suggest those, or did you come up with ideas for that, or?
So the murals that you've seen recently are part of a commission that I did as the artist in residence at HeartShare Human Services for New York. HeartShare is an organization that provides for adults with disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities. So these are disabilities that people were born with, not caused by accidents or ailments later on in life. And it's an important distinction to make, because it means that in many ways these folks have been ostracized since childhood.
Absolutely.
So some of them, not all of them, but some of these individuals live in group homes that are provided by HeartShare. Prior to the pandemic, I would go to the day habs, what are called day habs, day habilitation centers. And I had a studio space, I had workshops, people would come in, just drop in, make art with me. It was a place for folks to make friends and to not feel stigmatized, to just have fun. I was in charge of visual art, but they also had folks leading dancing and cooking and other kinds of activities to learn and socialize. But anyway, so after the pandemic hit, I started doing workshops over Zoom. But the director noticed that some of the folks who were cooped up in the group homes just started feeling extra isolated. I mean, this was a demographic that was already isolated in so many ways. And many of them, even before the pandemic, wouldn't necessarily leave the group homes. Like the ones who came to the day habs were very active, and some of them had gone to high school, they'd had jobs, but the folks in the group homes weren't necessarily that way, depending on physical mobility, interest in leaving, and also staffing issues. So the director asked if I would start painting murals for people who were homebound. Not all of them were homebound, but again, there was a certain percentage of them that were. And they just spent so much time in their rooms. And the organization had a mural program a long time ago, but the artist who was in charge of it moved out of state. So she asked me to do it, to just start painting things. And yes, people did have some input because these murals were going into their rooms, into their bedrooms. They were going to have to stare at these all day. So they better like them. Right?
Of course.
But honestly, all of them wanted me to have creative license. So every single person gave a theme or a subject. And I was told they also chose the color of their room, and all of the rooms had bright colors, except for 2, which had light olive paint jobs. But the rest of them were like Caribbean, pink and yellow and lilac, like very happy, beautiful colors. So I knew, okay, since this individual chose this shade of pink, then she'll probably want colors that complement this shade of pink in her mural. So one lady, for instance, said, I would like a floral garden. And I was thinking, okay, I could do that. How could I make it a little bit more distinctive? So I asked if I could add flowers, if I could add butterflies to the flowers. I asked if I could add a peacock, and she said yes to these things. And really from there, I just had at it. I just had fun. I just painted.
Right. Interesting. So would you like to share some of your written work with us?
Yeah,
Take a pic.
So I would like to read a short story from my book, Desert Fox by the Sea.
Mhm.
This is from in Waddle in Arizona. It has mainly flash fiction, but also some longer poems in it. I will be reading a short story called The Lucky Ones. Before Tinder and Grindr and OkCupid, we had the East End Bridge. It was not a land of love, but a land of fucks, and you could give as many or as few as you wanted. But you came there to lie in a bed of used condoms, shit-covered leaves, and broken glass with one intention: to give or receive at least one fuck. Alcohol and drugs were merely appetizers, and the only restaurant you go to just for appetizers is TGI Fridays. All others either win or lose you with the main course. Summer after summer, the East End Bridge boasted a loyal customer base. Even in the wintertime, you could find local kids embracing one another, panting little clouds of their warm breath into the air, stretched out on a strip of cardboard, if they were lucky. A mediocre meal is better than no meal at all. Everybody's got to eat. Or, as my mom used to say, everybody's got needs. We went there because most of us didn't have our own bedrooms like kids in the movies. Most of our parents didn't have jobs, at least not steady ones, which meant our trailers were almost never conveniently absent after school. And none of us had our own cars, let alone hot rides with leather seats. Privacy was another middle-class luxury we couldn't afford. You either went all the way under the East End Bridge or saved yourself for marriage, like Pastor Jenkins commanded from the pulpit of our otherwise abandoned strip mall church. Chastity is a virtue. Chastity is divine. Chastity will save you from hellfire. I had planned on saving myself for marriage, less out of a concern for hell than a concern for cutting myself on the smashed bourbon bottle under the East End Bridge. It was no bed of roses. Even that time, our biology teacher, Ms. Russell, discarded 15 bouquets there. Her fiancé sent the flowers, one for each month they had dated, after she found him cheating with his niece. A few of us were huddled around a bonfire one Saturday night when it started raining petals and thorns. While the blanket of red and green improved the scenery a little, our spot under the bridge was still as sorry as it had ever been. Yes, I'd claw myself out of town if I had to and lose my virginity someplace clean and quiet. Anywhere but there. I didn't think that was too much to ask. Then I saw Pastor Jenkins fucking my mom doggy style. Most kids hear their parents having sex at some point, but few have the misfortune of catching them in the act. Best case scenario, it's mom and dad tossing and turning under the sheets with a moan here and there. His cock and her snatch remain a mystery. Worst case scenario, it's mom with someone old enough to be your grandpa, both of them playing it rough with every wrinkle and sweat gland in plain sight. Her tits are flopping faster than your cousin flips hash browns at the Waffle House down the street. His ass looks like something that belongs on a 100-year-old toad, and both parties are breathing so hard, you're convinced they're about to break. It's poignant when the ancient pastor cries, "Jesus!" I yelled, "I hate you!" as he withdrew from mom and ran out the door. I escaped so quickly that I never saw them register that I had witnessed the debacle. After that, I thought nothing of fornicating under the East End Bridge. His name was Ned, he was in my Spanish class, and he rode me on a flattened Budweiser box. All right, so that was that.
Very, very frank sexuality there. It's like very, I mean, it's true to life in so many ways. I mean, you know, you have that, it's in your face, you know, kind of brutality of life, you know.
I can see the theme of disappointment in the story, beyond the fact that it is modern. It has to do with situations that happen every day in the modern time. So it's reality anyway. That's the way I see it. So that's very commendable. I could see the imageries as presenting the stories. I could capture the whole thing. Does this really help you in your, is it your production skill? Does it help you in your writing skill, or is your writing skill that assists you in production?
I mean, I would say that anytime I'm imagining any kind of story, I still imagine images. I can't really separate the two, and that's one of, and apparently that's a way of thinking. There are people who do think in concrete images, and there are people who don't. I would say one informs the other. I'm glad that I think that way. My husband does not. It's very funny. So I have this thing where if you start describing something, if you're just telling me a story about something that happened that day, and maybe it's unpleasant, if you start describing any of the details, I'm immediately going to picture everything. He's just the opposite. He can't, like, you really have to go into detail and he has to think about it. But the pictures don't automatically come to him. Yeah, but it helps. I mean, with filmmaking, you do have to think about every shot.
Yes.
Right. It's not. So I think the frustration that many people who come from a strict literary background have if they enter filmmaking, if they have a film project, let's say they take one of their screenplays, chances are it's written more like a play, like a stage play, or more so like fiction, just because that is their background. And they haven't necessarily written it in a way that allows for visual storytelling, because there's so much emphasis on dialogue. And dialogue can, of course, be wonderful in a movie. It can, depending on the film and depending on how it's written and performed, yes. But you also have to think about the images. You have to think about some of the framing. Even if you're writing the film and you're not directing it, or you're not the cinematographer, you still have to have some of those things in mind. Not everything needs to be talked out either.
So speaking of images and painting, I have an interesting quote that I would like you to reflect on and give us some thoughts. Painting is silent poetry, and poetry is painting that speaks. That's Plutarch. I just wondered how do you interpret that?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons why I find both forms, poetry and painting, appealing is that you can achieve similar but different things. So in poetry, you can be quite literal. You can describe images or happenings or ideas so concretely. You also have the chance to achieve very abstract ideas and really try and articulate them. Whereas in painting, even though you're still seeking an emotional response as a painter, you're not necessarily seeking an intellectual one. You're not putting words to thoughts. You're not putting words to ideas. The viewer has to come to something and articulate those ideas for themselves. And you might not have even painted with a specific idea in mind. There, as you were pointing out, Dustin, about some of the murals that you saw that I painted online, some of the symbolism, I'm sure I was thinking about in more literal terms, but a lot of it, I don't know what's coming out. I'm just
throw it in there.
I'm just
there it is. Right.
And I can assign meaning after the fact. Sure, in poetry,
that's the fun of it.
You can assign meaning after the fact, but I think there's still a lot more literal intention and articulation that goes into forming a poem versus forming a painting.
All right.
So would
Let
you
me
like
take
to
you
read us
back
a
to
poem, or-
production. We've talked about the pros, some of the good side of production. What are some of the challenges that you face, major challenges that you face during production? Because not everything will be smooth. Well, I know that where there's a way, there will always be a wall. And where there's a wall, there must always be a way. What are some of your challenges, especially during production?
Okay, yeah, sure. So during this particular time, during the pandemic, you have so many limitations with what you can shoot. So one of my projects was to shoot a film, in a feature film, and it's something I'm working on editing now. It's called Sirena's Gallery. I shot it in an art gallery by myself. And all of the other characters come in through scripted Zoom conversations. So that I had to work around all of these challenges with COVID safety precautions. And in some cases, actual rules, strict rules, to tell the story that I wanted to tell, because I had planned for this production before the shutdown, and I was going to go through with it. I just had to rewrite large portions of it and figure out how to make it instead. But even under normal circumstances, filmmaking can be very expensive. And it's not as expensive now with video production. You do have a lot of digital tools that are accessible to, I would say, just about any middle-class person. Whereas when my father got started in documentary film and advertising, like commercials in the 70s, everything was film. Some video was popping up in the late 70s, early 80s, but for the most part, people were shooting on film. And the tools were not accessible to everyday middle-class people. You had to be rich, and you had to be in the industry and have so many connections.
Exactly.
Some of those barriers are still in place. Even if the digital tools are accessible, there are still film festivals that you have to contend with, and they can be very expensive to enter. If you think lit mags are expensive or can be expensive with submission fees, film festivals are worse. Look, most lit mags will charge, like, if they charge, they'll charge like $3, $5. Film festivals, $50 to $100 per submission. That's pretty typical.
Wow.
And then if your film does get into the festival, you have to pay to get there yourself, because chances are you are not living right where the film festival is located.
Right.
So you need to travel there. You need to have a place to sleep. You have to pay for all your meals. I mean, I could go on and on. You can start to see how even if you make everything very cheaply with you and your friends, okay, but then you want people to see it. So you have
still gatekeepers, I guess you could say.
Yes, they're still gatekeepers, and you have to find your way.
Maybe in conclusion, we've got about 4 minutes. Would you like to try reading a poem?
I would love to do that. So I'm going to read a poem from my book, Belladonna Magic, Spells in the Form of Poetry and Photography. It has images in it as well, and they're all images that I created.
Beautiful.
Thank you. So this poem is called The Storm Inside a Woman. No one told me my body was an earthquake. My body's a hurricane, tornado. That my body was and will always be the eye of the storm. They only told me that I was a woman, that I was to be placid as a lake. Yet, how can I be human if I never thunder, if I never rain? I am wind and I am hail, just as I am flesh and I am blood. This lake will stir. this lake will flood. And when it's placid, it will hypnotize. Thank you.
You know, you
This
make
has
me
been a
remember
wonderful,
when
wonderful.
you know, as poets, when poets meet poets, they speak the same language. I got every bit of your lines completely, you know. That's
Right.
filled with metaphorical expression. And it seems that for every time you write, you can't escape imageries because you use more of metaphors to even convey a message. And that makes it easy for the readers to understand your message beyond the line itself. That was very impressive. What inspired you to write a poem?
So my mother is from El Salvador, and there is an extremely high femicide rate in her home country. The girls' education rate is one of the lowest in the world. Inequality there in general is just a huge problem. And it's one of the reasons why she was very eager to leave. That is not to say that this country is perfect by any means, or any country is. But she was extremely discouraged, to say the least, as a woman there. She never completed her education. It's just typical that women there get married when they turn 15, because that's when you become a woman. It's just culturally accepted there that what we would consider a girl here is a woman, a wife and mother as a teenager over there. So she just raised me to, I think by American standards, she would still be considered very conservative in many ways. She is a housewife. She is, she was intent on becoming a mother, but considering where she came from, she has very progressive ideas about gender roles. So she wanted me, and she wanted my two siblings to have the same ideas about women. Just let women have a voice in society. Let women do things.
Absolutely. We've got less than a minute, so I'm gonna go ahead and close out the show. Thank you for joining us. And this is Christine Sloan Stoddard. We can look at her work online, and she's Quell Bell Productions, one woman show, as she said. This has been New York Parrot's Literary Corner, and thank you again, Christine.
Thank you.
Very welcome. I think it'll cut off here in a minute. Waiting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.